deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? My tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I would go with the throng and lead them in the procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. My soul is cast down within me. Therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and from Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have gone over me. By day the Lord commands his steadfast love, and at night his song is within me, a prayer to the God of my life. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? As with a deadly wound in my bones, my adversaries taunt me, while they say to me all the day long, where is your God? Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. Our reading today comes from the 42nd Psalm as we continue our series on the Lament Psalms. And just as a reminder, as we talk about lament, the biblical category of lament, what we're talking about is a way of prayer, a mode of prayer in which we are confessing and recognizing that everything is not okay. In particular, in a time like we live in right now, when many Christians and many churches are propagating a message that everything is okay and everything's going to be okay. The lament stands as a counterpoint to that, as a different mode of biblical prayer in which we confess that everything is not okay, and that in fact is a sign and a show of faith, of true and honest faith. And this form of prayer really invites us to pray honestly and openly before God. Sometimes faith can pretend to be overly optimistic. And faith is put forward by some people as a way of saying, you shouldn't process anything negative, you shouldn't feel anything negative. Anything negative, any sign of doubt or struggle is a sign or a show of a lack of faith. The biblical category of lament just undermines that entirely and says that just is simply not the case. That struggle and turmoil and doubt and anger and fear, far from being a show of a lack of faith, can very much be signs of faith if they're brought to God in prayer. And so we want to continue to encourage you as a church family to be engaged in lament, in particular in this season, as we need this language to be able to help process some of the things that we may be experiencing and bringing it to the Lord. Also want to remind us as we look at the 42nd Psalm that the Psalms are poetry. In fact, more than likely they were lyrics to songs that were written. And so they come in a poetic form, and part of that is going to mean that the form is important to understanding the meaning, not just knowing the words, but the form of the poem itself. And so I want to encourage you to be mindful of that as you're reading. And many of your translations, as I showed you yesterday, many of your translations are going to help you recognize it as poetry by breaking it down into the stanzas, into the verses, and showing you how the poetry is actually structured. So not every translation does that, but most do, and it's a really helpful way for you to notice the form and how that form can contribute to your understanding of the poem itself. And lastly, I want to remind us, as it relates in particular to this psalm, that the voice of the psalmist, as we read from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the voice of the psalmist in the end of the day is Jesus. He's the one praying the psalms with us. And he's the one. Why can we lament? Because Jesus himself lamented. And we'll see that's the case here in the 42nd Psalm. And one of the most famous phrases in all of the Psalms, "Why are you cast down, O my soul?" is actually going to be found on the lips of Jesus as he's in Gethsemane in Matthew chapter 26. That Jesus himself employs this language as he relates to God. And so he gives it as a gift to us, and we are called to employ it in our relationship to God. So, just a couple quick of those introductory notes, and I want to focus today on the 42nd Psalm and these the four basic movements of this poem. There's a opening stanza in verses 1 through 4. There's a refrain that's going to be repeated in the middle and at the end that kind of holds the psalm together. And there's going to be a second stanza after the first refrain, and then we'll close with that same refrain that was in the middle again. And it's important to notice that form again because it's this refrain that's going to kind of hold and contain the intense personal struggle found in the first two stanzas. And so this refrain is actually going to be very critical in understanding and interpreting this psalm and how this psalm is structured. So let's look together at the first stanza. He begins famously with the line, "As the deer pants for flowing streams, so my pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God." That word pants in the Hebrew is actually very similar to how we would talk about onomatopoeia, like a word like buzz. The word itself is a sound, and that word for pants is alluding to the sound an animal makes as it's lapping up water or panting as it's pursuing water. And so that word is meant to evoke a strong sense of thirst within us. And here the psalmist appeals to the image of a deer. And why this image of a deer? Well, the picture as the psalm develops is that this deer is thirsty because it's being hunted. It's cut off from its place of sanctuary and safety. It's on the run, and it's being hunted down. And the psalmist is comparing himself to this deer that's being hunted down. So that's the image that's being employed as we launch into this psalm. Some have speculated about the occasion of this psalm. Some have suggested that it's David as he's on the run from Saul, or perhaps Absalom there in 1st or 2nd Samuel. That may be the case, but it's really not necessary. And this is part of how the Psalms are written. We're not told about the specifics of the details that led to the writing of the psalm because this psalm is meant to be used in many different circumstances. And that's part of the richness of the Psalms. And so the psalmist here appeals to the language of the soul. My soul longs or pants for you. The soul in Hebrew understanding is the passionate yearning or hunger. It's actually connected to the same root word as throat and breath. And it's the place where we breathe in, we hunger, we experience these things. And so this idea is that there's this deep hunger and passionate yearning for God. And the psalmist here talks about this. God compares flowing streams to the living God. As the deer pants for flowing streams, my soul thirsts for God, for the living God. That parallel structure there. And the phrase flowing stream is actually, in the Hebrew, is living water. Living water, living God. Those two things are standing in parallel to one another. And that language is going to show up all throughout the scriptures. So the soul has this thirsting and this hungering, this longing for God. And we're not quite sure why at this point. But we get a hint at the end of verse 2. When shall I come and appear before God? In other words, what we're beginning to recognize is the psalmist is, just like the deer is cut off from a place of sanctuary and safety, well, the psalmist is cut off from God's sanctuary, from the temple itself. When shall I come and appear before God? And we see that really begin to get clarified in verse 4, where he talks about remembering and pouring out my soul, how I would go with a throng and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise, a multitude keeping festival. In other words, why this is a lament, why the psalmist is so anguished of soul is because he's cut off from God's presence in the temple. He's not able to be with God's people in God's presence. And that's part of the reason why I chose this psalm as we think about lament, because I think this psalm is very appropriate to what we're experiencing right now. This longing to be gathered together in God's presence with God's people, to be leading in procession to the house of God, me as a pastor to be a part of that, leading people in procession to the house of God, in the presence of God, with great joy, with glad songs. And the memory of such things stirs a pain in my own heart. And I'm sure many of you, as you think about, even as grateful as I am for technology and be able to do video and online things, it's nothing compared to being gathered in person. And so there's a lament because something's missing. And as good as prayer is and individual prayer is, there's an incompleteness that can't happen because he's not able to gather with God's people in God's presence at the temple. And that's what he's alluding to. C.S. Lewis had a great statement about this that I wanted to read you. He says that about the psalmist's longing. He says, "These poets knew far less reason than we for loving God. They did not know that he offered them eternal joy, still less that he would die to win it for them. Yet they expressed a longing for him, for his mere presence, which comes only to the best Christians or to Christians in their best moments. They long to live all their days in the temple so that they may constantly see the fair beauty of the Lord. Their longing to go up to Jerusalem and appear before the presence of God is like a physical thirst. From Jerusalem, his presence flashes out in perfect beauty. Lacking that encounter with him, their souls are parched like a waterless countryside. They crave to be satisfied with the pleasures of his house. Only there can they be at ease like a bird in the nest. One day of those pleasures is better than a lifetime spent elsewhere." This is the kind of longing the psalmist alludes to. And it is the memory of these experiences that becomes a source of pain for him. He also alludes to an enemy there in verse 3, "While they say to me all the day long, where is your God?" This is a Satan, an adversary, who looks at the circumstances and draws a conclusion that either A, God has abandoned you, or B, God is so distant to be irrelevant. In other words, if God exists, he's of no help to you. Just look at your circumstances. That's what the enemy is taunting. And I think many of us could identify and connect with that even now. Where's God right now? Where's God in the midst of this pandemic? Where's your God to help you? And we feel the sting of such taunts. And so he continues and pours out his heart and soul. And he uses this language, these things I remember as I pour out my soul. In other words, what he's not allowing is these emotions to get stuck within him, but he's pouring them out. And that's critically important in the life of prayer. That's part of what lament is bringing and processing all of our strong emotions and strong feelings and strong thoughts and dark thoughts in prayer with God. Then he goes into the refrain, verse 5, "Why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God." This is a form of prayer called soliloquy of soul talk. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to close with this soliloquy, and then we'll talk about the second part of this psalm tomorrow. But he speaks to his own soul. He probes the soul, asking the soul to furnish its reasons for feeling the way it does. Because oftentimes for many of us, we don't know why we feel the way we do. And the psalmist recognizes that and has to reason with his soul. What's going on inside of you? And then he orients his soul. Hope in God, for I shall again praise him. God may feel distant, but the God of the psalmist, this God, is the God who delivers, who crosses distances, whose power and presence is not constrained to a temple. And so the psalmist orients his soul back to God. And tomorrow we'll look at the second half of Psalm 42 and see what it has to contribute as we continue this reflection.